This video is sponsored by 40k combat cards. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the Best Armies in 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated armies from the past weekend. This time, it's for the weekend of November 9th and 10th, 2024, and it's been a bit of a roller coaster of a weekend. We haven't had too many events this week, but the ones that we did have were relatively large. This includes the Raccoon Rumble over in Germany, a large 200-player Major Plus level event, also the Utah Open, California Cup, and Battle Brothers GT, all large events. Now first, before we get into the metagame breakdown, let's talk about streaming, because there was a ton of it this week. That includes the California Cup over by the Xenos Petting Zoo internal streaming team. The Utah Open was covered by our friends over at War Games Live. The West Sydney Teams event, although we are not going to be talking about Teams events in this video, that was an 8-player team event down in Australia. That was covered by the Australis Tabletop Network, and the Cardiff Carnage GT was covered over by Glasshammer Gaming. Lots and lots of content and streaming for you to watch if you want to keep up to date on the results from these events. But with that, let's dive into a metagame breakdown and talk about which armies are the frontrunners this week. First off, Chaos Space Marines. Reports of their death were greatly exaggerated. They took down 3 events this week, including the Bunker Down, Flames of Autumn GT, and the Raccoon Rumble, going undefeated at that big, basically super major 200-player event. Genestealer Cults also doing fairly well, I think, as is to be expected after their recent buffs. They took down the Cardiff Carnage as well as the California Cup. Now, to be fair, the California Cup did run 8 rounds, and so there was not a single undefeated at the end, but they were the #1 spot, and that's what we're going to be talking about this time around. Chaos Knights also having another good week, 2 in a row here, taking down the Broadsword Wargaming GT as well as the Battle Brothers GT. Speaking of the Battle Brothers GT, Orks also looking pretty good over there. They went undefeated, coming in first in that event, but also went undefeated at the Hydra event GT with 2 separate detachments as well, which is pretty exciting. Tau Empire also having a pretty good week, taking down the 40k Iron Man. Iron Man events are typically one-day events, so that is an absolute test of skill to run Tau Empire over that long runtime, but they also took down the San Antonio Shootout. Imperial Knights also went undefeated at that San Antonio Shootout and took down the Feast of Blades GT. Ultramarines have basically subsumed all other forms of compliant Space Marine chapters, so we're not going to be talking about any of the other Space Marine chapters that come from the standard codex. We do have a little bit of non-compliance to talk about, but Ultramarines are the only compliant chapter being played currently. They went undefeated at the Battle Brothers GT and Flames of Autumn event. We do have that one non-compliant chapter, that is Blood Angels from the Frostfire GT, and we'll certainly be talking about them in addition. And moving on to some armies with less event wins under their belt. Chaos Demons with a stellar showing at the Raccoon Rumble. Same with Adepta Sororitas, that event looking pretty diverse. Adeptus Mechanicus also at the 40k Iron Man event. Astra Militarum also continuing to do well, taking down the Broadsword Wargaming GT. Now, it'll be interesting to see whether or not the changes that have been proposed in the World Championships of Warhammer FAQ are implemented. If they are, then we may see Astra Militarum get hit a little bit, but they are still going strong so far. And I'm likely to talk about those changes in the future. And last, and probably least, Tyranids at the North Staffs GT. Now, real quick, I didn't include any results from the Utah Open, which I mentioned was being streamed by War Games Live. Unfortunately, that event is looking like it's going to be a super long one. And at the time of recording, it's not actually finished yet. So I don't have the results from that to include in this list here. If it does complete by the time I'm editing this slide, then I will include those Utah Open results. But as it stands, it is late and I'm very tired, and unfortunately I can't wait for the last couple of games to get finished there. But all told, we are kind of seeing a bit of a condensation of the metagame. More armies than not are getting multiple undefeated results over the course of the weekend. We're seeing less of the diversity that we saw a couple of weeks ago. Armies like Chaos Space Marines and Genestealer Cults do look like they are poised to be very successful moving on into the future through the remainder of this format. And we'll see if that continues on into the future. Now, before we jump into the lists themselves, let's take a brief moment to remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, all the YouTube stuff, and take a break for sponsor time. Did you know 40k used to be a card game? And actually, it still is. It's called Warhammer 40k Combat Cards. This is based on the 1980 Citadel combat cards that was a reuse of ancient Citadel miniatures from the dawn of time in a trading card game setting. And for the last 5 years, Warhammer 40k combat cards has sought to bring that old game back to modern audiences on iOS, Android, and on Steam. The current incarnation of Warhammer 40k combat cards uses modern game mechanics as well as updated visuals using modern Games Workshop miniatures painted by the Heavy Metal team. So, not only is it a good way to pass the time, but you can also use it to brush up on your miniature knowledge. So download the game from the links in the video description and enjoy live events, an ever-evolving card range, as well as new features currently being released, such as a Horde mode, Apocalypse mode, and Wild Card unlocks. Big thanks to Warhammer 40k Combat Cards for sponsoring this video, and I'll see you at the card table. So starting at the top with the Raccoon Rumble GT, this was held over in Germany, and again is the largest event of the weekend. 200 player super major level of event. And what we're going to be talking about today are Chaos Space Marines run by Manuel Weyand. Now, Manuel was running a Renegade Raiders detachment, a fairly standard build from Chaos Space Marines, but I do want to give a shout out that many of the other Chaos Space Marine results from this weekend were actually running Chaos Cults. So that is to say that there is a lot of diversity within Chaos Space Marines themselves. That said, Renegade Raiders, obviously, I think definitely the most straightforward of detachments, even if it doesn't have the same level of hard skew that we see from a Chaos Cult, for example. Now, this list was rocking Abaddon the Despoiler, a Chaos Lord, 2 Cultist Mobs, as well as 2 units of Legionaries. We are carrying those to the fight with a single Chaos Rhino, and adding in some utility in the form of Chaos Bikers, some backline shooting from a trio of Chaos Predator Destructors, alongside a unit of Chosen to go hang out either with the Chaos Lord or with Abaddon the Despoiler. He does get there advanced in charge if he does hang out with those Chosen, and that is a pretty good spot for him to jump into if we don't need the additional threat range on the standard Chaos Lord. We're then taking some sort of mid-board control in the form of 2 units of Obliterators. The additional AP and bonuses that these guys can get in Renegade Raiders are pretty good for their usual playstyle of just jumping into the center of the table and using their once per game indirect fire to just vaporize something. We're also adding a bunch of jump pack infantry in the form of a Raptor unit, largely for utility, as well as 2 units of 5 Warp Talons. Now, it's been interesting to see the 2 units of 5 Warp Talons more and more commonly as sort of the format is maturing, because those guys are really incentivized to kill whatever they charge in order to give them their ability to jump back into strategic reserve, and that is a little dicey once you have the 5 models. However, that said, the +1 AP is one of the better offensive buffs when targeting enemies on objectives from the detachment ability for Warp Talons, and having these smaller units means that you don't necessarily lose as much as you would if you were to commit a large 10-man brick, for example, and then fail to kill whatever your target was, so you didn't get the ability to teleport. So these guys can act a little bit more as trading units in this style of list. And that's kind of what we see going on in the list. We have these 2 units of 2 Obliterators. Those are relatively inexpensive, but pack a lot of punch, even if they aren't that high volume. We also have things like the 2 units of 5 Legionaries and the 5 Chosen as well. Oftentimes we'll see 10 Chosen or larger formations of Legionaries in order to be able to just hammer enemies down on objectives. But this list is very much trying to be a much more trading-oriented MSU, almost as a unit count skew. And that's backed up by Abaddon the Despoiler as well. He can act as an anchor to the list as you're sandpapering your opponent down. He can buff up the Predator Destructors by hanging out with them and then come in late game as you've knocked out or at least forced your opponent to commit with a lot of the threats to him and really just sort of run the table. So interesting build of Renegade Raiders. Not really reinventing the wheel here from Manuel, but still something a little bit different than the kind of like Vindicator Castle or the Emperor's Children builds that we've been seeing more recently. Now let's move over to one of the other large events of the weekend, the California Cup. This was obviously held over in San Diego, California, and as I mentioned before, was being streamed by the Xenos Petting Zoo team. This was a major level event, 93 players, very close to 100, and was won by Alex Spithopoulos, who was running Genestealer Cults. Now, Alex is on what is, I think, quickly becoming the most popular of Genestealer detachments, the Biosanctic Brood Surge. This is the offensive melee-oriented detachment for Genestealer Cults that offers bonuses to charges as well as the attacks of your melee weapons on the charge and can really pull an absolute immense amount of offensive power from units like Abominants alongside Aberrants, Pure Strain Genestealers, as well as Biophagus units that also get those buffs. We are running triple Abominants here. One of them has Predatory Instincts in order to give his unit infiltration Infiltration. We have a Clamavus, as well as a Patriarch and a Reductus Saboteur. So none of those Biophagus units, which we often see jumping into units like hybrid metamorphs to give another sort of on-table melee threat, but in this case, we're just going to be focusing on those Genestealers as well as the Aberrants. We have a single melee Acolyte hybrid unit, that one equipped with heavy mining tools, alongside 2 Hand Flamer Acolyte hybrid units just to add high OC, kind of anti-infantry clearing, plus 2 units of Neophyte hybrids for utility, and a little bit of shooting as well. We're rocking 3 units of 5 Aberrants to attach those Abominants into, 3 units of Achilles Ridge Runners, 2 individual Achilles Ridge Runners, those both equipped with heavy mortars. One of them has a spotter, so it can trigger its crossfire a little bit more easily by improving its ballistic scale by 1. The other one with a Survey Auger to remove cover from enemies that it shoots at. This is mostly in service of the other 2 Achilles Ridge Runners, which are rocking heavy mining lasers. So we can potentially use the Survey Auger Ridge Runner to fire at enemies in line of sight, strip cover from them, add its +1 AP effect, and then kill them with the 2 Ridge Runners, whereas the Spotter Ridge Runner isn't really that worried about opponents getting cover because it's going to be buffing melee attacks with its mortar shot. We have a single Goliath Rock Grinder to add that tough midboard transport vehicle. It can carry any of the Acolyte hybrid units into the fight and acts as a little bit of a melee unit itself, in addition to being just difficult to kill. And then the pièce de résistance for the list is actually 30 Pure Strain Genestealers, 2 units of 10, as well as a unit of 5. The little unit of 5 is interesting as a forward operator. These guys do infiltrate, and it can go up alongside the Reductus Saboteur to block off enemy infiltration and prevent enemy units from moving forward aggressively and screening out deep strikes from the units like the Aberrants. And then we have those 2 units of 10 Pure Strain Genestealers just to try to control the midboard, control where the opponent can move to prevent that screening potentially, and also clear out their units taking over the center. Not to mention the fact that one of those is going to be attached alongside that Patriarch to get his benefits as well. The Patriarch also, we should mention, is rocking the Biomorph adaptation, so he's going to be +1 AP and damage on his claws. We've been seeing a lot of these Biosanctum Breed Surge lists. All of them are kind of building in a similar direction. Exactly how they unlock that is unique to each list. Obviously, this one is not running any Biophagi, so the Acolyte hybrids in the army don't have any options for attachments to buff themselves and to get the additional attacks and charge bonuses from the detachment ability. But if you're mostly focusing on the Abominant units and the Genestealers in order to get those, then that's not that big of a loss, and the Acolyte hybrids are acting as support anyway. It's not that big of a deal. Now let's move over to another of the weekend's fairly large events, the Battle Brothers GT. This was an 85-player event, a total player cap of 100, but didn't quite meet that goal. I think we're basically going to talk about all 3 of the undefeated top 3 players in this event, but we're going to start by talking about Chaos Knights, and Chaos Knights had a fairly good weekend. Timothy Hoobsher went undefeated with a fairly interesting Chaos Knight list, including a Big Knight, which we don't typically see. It is a Cerastus Knight Atropos, which is fairly standard for the Big Knight inclusions, especially in Imperial Knights, Loyalist Knights, but also is, I imagine, just as effective inside a Chaos Knights army. The big benefit of the Atropos is that it has 2 pretty solid ranged attacks in addition to a fairly solid melee attack. One of the downsides of these Big Knights, obviously, is that depending on the chassis that you're bringing, you will often have to trade your ranged profile for your melee profile. The Atropos has the ability to use its Lascutter as a melee weapon, so it doesn't really have to make that trade-off. Instead, it's a bit of a jack of all trades, just pretty good at both melee and range, which makes it good, which makes it just generally one of the better knight options in general. Being a Cerastus chassis with a built-in invulnerable save and a higher base speed as well is also just icing on the cake. We have 4 War Dog Brigands making up the battle line. I actually just got myself some War Dog Brigands to add to my Chaos Demons army, and sort of speaking personally, this data sheet's very silly. War Dog Brigands are an incredible inclusion in any army they're brought into, but especially if you can buff them up in any way. We're also then bringing 6 War Dog Carnivores at their incredibly efficient points value. 140 points for that data sheet is great. We have 2 Nurgling Swarms as well to act as allies. All told, fairly standard Chaos Knights stuff. The big difference here is that we are running that Cerastus Knight Atropos in addition to 10 War Dogs instead of the 12 or 13 War Dogs that we would be seeing in an army built entirely around bringing as many War Dogs as possible. Now with that, we're going to stay with the Battle Brothers GT for one additional entry in here and talk about Orks. Blue Ford went undefeated with the faction running something that I think is a little interesting a Bully Boys list. Now, since the much criticized nerf to Mega Knobs after the Codex was originally released, Bully Boys basically fell just right off the radar. Everyone was taking high unit count armies, high model count armies, focusing on Warhorde almost exclusively, but it does seem like some of the other detachments are seeing more play. We're seeing Dread Mobs even come out of the woodwork and be relatively affected. Warhorde obviously is still effective, but this Bully Boys detachment, I think what didn't really go anywhere. It was still pretty strong, and getting the additional effect of that WA, especially since it has now been clarified that the WA being active works for basically all of your special abilities, whereas previously some of the Orc special abilities prior to the last update turned off depending on which round it was when you called the WA. Now you have 2 rounds of WA depending on your units, whether or not you have war bosses or knobs in your unit, and those 2 rounds will affect all of your relevant abilities. Now we have Gazgo Thraka in the list. He adds a ton of utility, 5 up critical hits for his unit plus lethal hits when Makari is still alive. That can affect you on both rounds that you're that can affect units on both rounds that you have the WA active. In addition, he's also just an enormous beat stick himself. We have Zodgrod Wartsnaga, who is the character attachment for Gretchen, gives them Scout, -1 to be hit and wounded as well. One of the best leadership abilities in the game, but obviously he only affects Gretchen. Probably one of the worst top-line statistical profiles in 40k. But that's okay, because they're super cheap, and Zodgrod's going to force them up the table into your opponent's face. We are running a Beast Boss with Ed Stompa alongside 2 War Bosses as well. We have 2 units of Beast Snaga Boys in the battle line, one of those getting attached with the Beast Boss, obviously. A unit of 20 Gretchen, as well as a unit of 10. The 20-man usually is Zodgrod's unit. Those guys get a huge scout move, and the large unit size allows them to take multiple objectives on the first turn, potentially allowing you to roll multiple dice to try to gain CP from the Gretchen's scrounging ability, and they also act as an incredible roadblock on turn 1. What you don't want to have happen, especially as a Bully Boys army, is be jammed for 2 turns. If your opponent can kind of steal momentum away from your army and jam your transports and your slower units before you're able to WA, or or between your 2 WAs, so they can mitigate the power of your WAs, then that's an absolute nightmare. And the Gretchen will basically keep that off of your transports for a turn, which is incredibly effective, especially for the relative inexpense of Zodgrod plus 20 Gretchen. The 20 Gretchen themselves are only 80 points, so you're paying 160 for that unit, and sometimes they're just almost impossible to kill. Some armies simply don't have what it takes to kill 20 models that are -1 to be wounded. We also have a Commandos unit in there as well to infiltrate and prevent that scout move from being blocked by enemy infiltrators. 1 unit of 2 Mega Knobs to turn on Gazgo's leadership ability, as well as a big unit, as well as 2 big units of 10 Knobs to attach those War Bosses into. We then have 3 units of Storm Boys for utility, a unit of Death Copters, which is an interesting inclusion. These guys are actually fairly high damage, hard to kill as well, and a relatively fast utility unit on top of that. They are fairly pricey for what you get, but they have a high wound count, so their defensive profile for their cost is actually very good. And not to mention the fact that they're bringing a couple missile launchers as well, which is always nice to have. Last and certainly not least, we have 4 trucks to carry those Knobs and Beast Snaga Boys to the fight. Overall, this is a fairly standard Orc build. I think it would look good both in Warhorde or in Bully Boys. Now, we'll go ahead and leave Battle Brothers GT for a moment here and talk about the San Antonio Shootout, a 60-player event held in San Antonio, Texas. This one was taken down by Tyler Rowe, rocking Tau Empire. We also saw some Imperial Knights go undefeated. I hope that's not this player's real name. I guess their parents might have been just really upset with them at some point. But we're going to rock into Tyler's Tau Empire list here. Tyler was running a Mont Ka detachment. This included Commander Farsight as well as an Enforcer Battlesuit Commander with Strike Swiftly. That's able to grant up to 2 units Scouts, which could include the Enforcer Battlesuit unit itself, but typically affects 2 other units like dedicated transports and things, for example, to allow the Tau army to Alpha Strike. The downside is that it does require you to start the bear on the table in order to make use of it, and in a relatively aggressive position as well, which can be a little bit tough for the Battlesuit units that have kind of a tough time maneuvering around terrain. But obviously that was not that too big of an issue for Tyler here. We do also have Commander Farsight, so if we are dropping a unit out of the sky, that might be it. Although, obviously, with the Assault and early game benefits that the Mont Ka detachment typically has, that might not have been the case. Now, this army's running 2 breacher teams alongside 2 devilfish to carry them into battle. We have 2 battlesuit team. We have 2 crisis battlesuit teams, 1 fire knife team, as well as 1 sunforge team. The fire knife team most likely is attaching in with that enforcer commander. It's rocking a bunch of missile pods, so it's adding a lot of long range shooting, which is fairly effective inside Mont Ka. They're kind of a mid strength, so they're not super good at shooting at high toughness stuff, but lethal hits certainly helps that. You can use focus fire as well to give them additional AP bonuses to punch through high armor saves, and you can even get them the angles that they need by giving them auto 6 advances. Moving on from that, we have a ghost kill battlesuit alongside a Pathfinder team to add some spotting. A total of 4 piranhas, which is interesting. We have 2 individual piranhas who can add some early game forward operation with their scout move, and then we have a unit of 2 piranhas as well. Now, given the fact that these guys have assault in the early turns of the game, can potentially auto 6 their advanced moves, plus a pretty long scout as well. These 2 piranhas can actually act in a bunch of different capacities. They can run up to the enemies and fire their fusion blasters plus their seeker missiles and actually do some serious damage, and or they can just act as a road bump for enemies. 2 piranhas sitting back to back is actually kind of an excessively long distance. Piranhas are a physically very large model, and so with that kind of incredible speed that they get on turn 1 potentially, they can actually act as a little bit of a screen for the enemy army and keep them penned in while your breacher teams and other units get in position to attack on battle round 2. We then have 3 Skyray gunships to add some long-range backline shooting alongside 3 units of stealth battlesuits for utility and spotting. Pretty interesting list. We have a little bit of midboard control from the Ghost Kill battlesuit as well as those Crisis battlesuits, either jumping in with rapid ingress and getting themselves positions, or just starting on the table and using the mobility of Mont Ka to prevent enemies from moving aggressively into the center because the battlesuits will just knock them down. We also have the breacher teams to act in that capacity too, and a bunch of these little utility units with some backline shooting from the Skyray gunships. It's interesting to see Skyrays in this. It's interesting to see Skyrays here because a lot of times what we'll see is actually ion cannon hammerheads in this slot in a Mont Ka detachment because of the lethal hits that they get. Having that high volume from those units gives them more opportunities to trigger lethal hits, which is definitely a huge combination that those kind of mid-strength weapons are looking for. However, the benefit that the Skyray gunships have is that they're good throughout the game. Even after your breacher teams have committed, your battlesuits have committed, and you've gotten all of those lethal hits that we've talked about from the Mont Ka detachment rule, after battle round 3, that expires. However, the Skyray gunships can still plug in the back and keep shooting, even if you don't have those lethal hits. They're still going to be working just fine. They have twin-linked missile rack attacks. Their potential output is extremely consistent over the course of the game without having to rely on any particular battle round to do their damage. Now, obviously, the second faction to go undefeated at this event is Imperial Knights, but we're actually going to be moving over to Feast of Blades to talk about Imperial Knights. This was a 38-player event, and this event was eventually won by Adrian James running Imperial Knights. I can't show you the placings for whatever reason. Unfortunately, they're being hidden by the event organizer. But running back through Adrian's games, he did go undefeated 5-0 with this Imperial Knights list. And this is a fairly standard Knights list. We just talked about Chaos Knights at length and talked about how good the Seratius Atropos is. I don't think I feel like a little bit of a broken record here. Atropos is pretty good, and this list was including 2 of them. No enhancements on them at all. Just 2 Atroposes, just doing Atropos stuff. We also have Canis Rex in there as well. It acts as a little bit tougher of a melee counterpunch. And we're following that up with an Armiger Helverin for some backline shooting, plus 3 Armiger Warglaves and a Calidus Assassin. Not much else to say about this one. Atroposes are good, I guess. Now, it's been a little while, but it's time for us to return to the Battle Brothers GT and talk about the final top placing at that GT. That was Mark Hurdle running Ultramarines. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we've talked extensively about Ultramarines on this channel, especially armies like the Ultramarines Vanguard Spearhead, that uses the kind of interlocking synergies of Ultramarine characters alongside their synergies with that detachment ability to get repeatable deep strikes out of Uriel Ventress, overlapping CP tax effects and things like that. That's all pretty good. Mark Hurdle, though, he's throwing all that away. He's taking a Gladius task force with Roboot Gilliman. This man cannot be stopped. He likes running his big tanks and his big stompy monsters, and that's what we're doing today. We've got Marnius Calgar, Robuti Gilliman, and Uriel Ventress, kind of the new trifecta of really powerful Ultramarines characters. It feels like every time Ultramarines become good, they have 3 of their 20 characters that ended up being pretty strong. In past editions, it was Calgar, Cassius, and Tigurias, but today we got Calgar, Gilliman, and Ventress. Marneus Calgar gives you an enormous, both Marneus Calgar and Roboute Gilliman give you huge, aggressive melee counter punches. One of the big benefits that Roboute Gilliman has in the Gladius Task Force detachment is his ability to utilize Assault Doctrine basically whenever he wants to. He does have his new capacity to move through walls, but he is still relatively slow, and the ability to advance and charge can get him into the fight on about round 3 onwards. Marneus Calgar obviously can always do that, and both of them give you huge amounts of CP generation as well. Marneus Calgar gives you 1 CP in your own command phase. Roboute Gilliman gives you 2 free uses of stratagems over the course of the battle round. So this army is basically playing with somewhere around 5 CP per round. And with the incredible stratagems that Gladius Task Force has, you have lots of opportunities to use Gilliman's free stratagems on top of that. Uriel Ventress gives you access to a CP tax effect in addition to giving you deep strike on one of your infantry units. We're running 2 foot assault intercessor squads, just the basic bare bones ground troops, not the jump back assault intercessors, which are much more expensive these days. We also have a intercessor squad, a standard one for just some backline objective holding. Following that up, we do have a single unit of jump back assault intercessors to act as utility, plus a Centurion Devastator squad. And I think this is where Uriel Ventress is going to be pointing the benefits of that deep strike, giving these guys the opportunity to rapid ingress into an annoying spot or deep strike in with line of sight to the target. Use Storm of Fire, for example, to give them additional AP and ignore cover. Allows them to punch through basically any target, regardless of what their stats are. And given the fact that these guys have baked in rerolls, they do that essentially independently of what your Oath of Moment target is. We do have a unit of company heroes. Now, there are a couple different attachment options for this. Marneus Calgar is fairly good in company heroes because he plays very aggressively, and getting the -1 to wound on him and his Victrix Honor Guard is fairly solid, but you can also put Uriel Ventress in there to allow him to more aggressively apply his CP tax effect. Whichever character is not jumping into those company heroes, I imagine is likely going to be jumping into an Assault Intercessor squad to get those buffs. We then also have an Infiltrator squad to prevent enemies from deep striking on the backline. And last, but certainly not least, 2 Land Raider Redeemers. Now, the Redeemers don't have the transport capacity to carry that Centurion Devastator squad around. Marneus Calgar usually wants to stay on the table in order to give you his CP generation, but the Assault Intercessors are just a great occupant for these because they give the Redeemer some additional capacity to punch up, clear objectives away, and add a bunch of OC, especially with wound rerolls that can help them dominate the center of the table. And especially alongside the ridiculous amount of CP that you're using, being able to drop the Wombo combo of Smokescreen and Armor of Contempt on these things is pretty easy. Overall, this is just fairly wild. It's interesting to see something that's pretty similar, has a lot of the same notes as the Ultramarines Vanguard list, but is instead just rocking Roboute Gilliman and a bunch of Land Raiders and just running up the table and being as aggressive as possible. Now, moving back over to the United Kingdom, let's talk about the Napalm Hobbies Frostfire GT, where Blood Angels went undefeated, so we can keep talking about Space Marines for a little bit longer. This is a Blood Angels Iron Storm Spearhead. So this is, in fact, not running any of the frankly amazing detachments inside the Blood Angels chapter supplement itself. Instead, we're just playing regular Space Marines, but taking some cool Blood Angels characters. That includes Chief Librarian Mephiston, as well as Lamarties and the Sanguinor. Now, to be fair, I will mention that this is not a combination that we have not seen before. Units like Ball Predators, and potentially even now the new Death Company Dreadnoughts, do have a lot of synergy with Ironstorm Spearhead, and the ability to include units like the Sanguinor, and even just big beatsticks like Lamarties and a bunch of Death Company Marines, is pretty solid. So it's definitely not coming out of nowhere, but it is cool to see because it's not been a composition that we've seen in a really long time. We're also running a Gravis Captain with the Flesh is Weak, so he has a 4+ Feel No Pain and his damage reduction effect on top of that. We also have Chief Librarian Mephiston, who's a lone operative, again with a 4+ Feel No Pain, so we're already seeing a little bit of a theme here, plus a Tech Marine with Adept of the Omnissiah to blank incoming damage. We then have 2 Ball Predators. These guys are rocking their Flamestorm Cannons and Heavy Flamers, not taking the top-mounted Assault Cannons today, but that's probably pretty fair. The Ball Predators in this detachment even have some additional synergy inside Ironstorm Spearhead. They can, for example, reactively shoot if you bring them below half strength with an attack, which on top of their already kind of prodigious Overwatch makes engaging with them super weird, and the fact that they're relatively fast and have assault on all their main weapons allows them to put themselves in positions to apply those benefits more often than you'd expect. We then have that big unit of 10 Death Company Jump Pack Marines to jump around with Lamarties that gives the army a little bit of a pretty strong and long movement melee counterpunch, although without the additional attacks and strength from from, for example, Liberator Strike Force, or the Advance in Charge from either that or Gladius Task Force. These guys are going to be relatively slow and don't hit as hard as you could expect Death Company to, although it's not like the unit isn't going to be good. They're hard to kill, they have a Feel No Pain, -1 damage. They also just have a bunch of attacks with baked-in hit rerolls as well, so it's always going to do something. Those hit rerolls can even combo with Mercy's Weakness. That allows you to get sustained hits. It is relatively expensive on these guys, but it does give you the opportunity to trigger potentially a lot of lethal sustained attacks. We then have 2 Gladiator Reapers to make use of that Mercy's Weakness combo, an Infiltrator Squad, and ooh, it's nice to see these guys in here, Invader ATVs. I'm actually kind of happy to see these dudes inside an Ironstorm Spearhead. We talked about them when the most recent update went down, but for 60 points, you get a multi-melta, as well as a couple bolt rifle shots and a really resilient profile. 8 wounds is just pretty good for their cost. And given the fact that that multi-melta is also benefiting from the floating rerolls for Ironstorm Spearhead, I think these guys are uniquely strong in this detachment. We're then rocking 3 Predator Destructors in the backline as well, with autocannons and las cannons. A pretty unique list, to be honest. We have a pretty strong sort of baseline of shooting between the Predator Destructors, the Gladiator Reapers, and the Bald Predators. So just a basically huge number of Space Marine vehicle hulls that we're jumping on the table. And that's also very difficult to dive into because we have 2 fight-firsting characters between the Sanguinor and Mephiston. We also have that huge unit of Death Company Marines that can be very aggressive if it needs to. And between Mephiston and the Gravis Captain as well, we have some characters that are very difficult to kill and very sticky to remove, which can keep enemies off of these vehicles. Super cool composition, way different than anything we've seen for a really long time, and makes use of some of the new profiles from the new Codex supplement in a really interesting and unique way. Absolutely love to see lists like these. Now with that, let's go back to the Raccoon Rumble and talk about some of the other armies that did well at this event, because we did see some armies that didn't really have too much success elsewhere go undefeated here. That includes a ridiculous showing from Niklas Fritzchen with Chaos Demons. Niklas had 4-20-0 results on his record. Now, this was using differential scoring, so those mean that he defeated his opponent by 50 or more points in order to get that score. That is insane. Now, what army did he do it with? Niklas was running an army kind of focused on battle line infantry, but with a very interesting combination of greater demons. He was taking Be'lakor to protect his backline stuff from shooting. Obviously, Be'lakor is kind of a whole can of worms inside a Chaos Demon army. He's expensive. He doesn't really do that much damage. He's got a pretty good ranged attack, and he's okay in melee. But for the most part, you're taking him for his support. He can prevent enemies from shooting at the army, and he enables a multi-allegiance army by providing a Shadow of Chaos aura that works irrespective of the allegiance keywords that its particular demons have. So in this case, we're rocking Kairos Fateweaver and a Lord of Change, so we do have 2 Tzeentch Greater Demons, but we also have Shalaxi Hellbane, so we're also potentially delivering a Slanesh Greater Demon, and Be'lakor allows any of those units to teleport around alongside him. Now that Lord of Change is rocking the Everstave, as is probably kind of required to extend its range and allow it to duel with enemy guns while being protected by Be'lakor's aura. If it doesn't have the Everstave, it actually gets kind of outranged by a lot of stuff. Kairos Fateweaver is maybe one of the most interesting inclusions here. The big benefit that he brings is actually CP generation, especially if you're using uppy-downy effects early on in the game, or even Draught of Terror to buff up your ranged attacks early in the game. Kairos can regenerate that CP very quickly, and given how good demons are at scoring their tactical secondaries, especially a list like this that has so many small utility units, demons often operate with kind of a CP, demons often operate on kind of a command point deficit. So Kairos shores that up. He also has a CP tax for enemy units, and he's got an indirect fire gun, although his gun is definitely the least exciting thing on his profile. It's it's extremely dicey, and usually he just hangs out with the Lord of Change to buff his strength, and they all combine their fire on a single target and potentially kill it. Shalaxi Hellbane's in here to just absolutely dumpster basically whatever she touches. That 425 points is quite a lot, but Shalaxi will kill just about anything in the game if you're able to get them into the fight. We also have the Changeling in there as a lone operative. And then, like I said, just tons and tons and tons of utility units. A unit of 3 Nurglings to add infiltrators. Those guys can block off enemies from blocking your own pregame moves, because we also have a Seeker unit, which has a huge scout value, so a lot of mid-board control already in the list. We then have a unit of Pink Horrors, one of the most difficult to kill high OC battleline infantry in 40k, with their ability to split once you kill them and continuously regenerate wounds and essentially expand their unit size even as you're attacking them. They're very, very difficult to peel off of backline objectives, especially if you can use Bellicor to prevent enemies from getting all their attacks targeting the Pink Horror Squad, and you can limit what can attack them. You only kill a couple at a time, and those will just split into blues, then split into brimstones, and continuously recycle themselves. We then have a unit of Plague Bearers as well to sticky objectives and act as another high OC unit, and then 3 units of Screamers. Demons have kind of a glut of these like between 65 and 80 point utility units. Seekers are a good example, and Screamers are another one. They're low OC and don't really do that much damage, although they do have a mortal wound bombing effect, which is kind of nice to have, but they're also just super cheap and ridiculously fast. So these guys can even stand on the table and complete most secondaries just by themselves without really having to work for it. Whereas a lot of other demon utility units, you may have to teleport around in order to get their benefits. Screamers will just score by themselves. So with all that in mind, it's no wonder that Niklas was able to go 6-0 with so many 20-0 wins on his record. He has some real tricksy effects between Bellicor, teleporting stuff around and delivering greater demons, Kairos regenerating your CP when you do that, and Shalaxi Hellbane acting as a melee anchor. And then that's all behind a ridiculous number of scoring units that are able to continuously score out your secondary draws. Another cool list to see that's a little bit different than the kind of standard Nurgle demon focused armies that we've been seeing from Demons most recently. Now with that, let's talk about Matthias Bellman, who was running Adepta Sororitas at the event and took them to a 6-0 record. Not quite the same level of domination that we saw from Chaos Demons here, but still a pretty good result regardless. Matthias was running a Bringers of the Flame detachment, so the very aggressive detachment that we've been seeing from Sisters for a really long time. And this list looks fairly standard. We have Junith Eruita to generate some command points, Morven Val alongside the Triumph of St. Catherine, a Palatine with Righteous Rage, 1 unit of 10 Battle Sisters, a unit of 3 Archoflagellants for utility, some forward operation from a Sister Novitiate squad, 2 Castigators, both of them rocking Castigator autocannons, alongside 2 Exorcists, a unit that we've been seeing basically locked into the composition for Adepta Sororitas most recently. Normally, in the past, we saw 3 Castigators and a bunch of Immolators, but it seems like Exorcists, either in 2s or 3s, are becoming more and more popular, alongside a Paragon Warsuit unit for Morven Val to jump into, 2 Immolators as well. Now, moving over to the 40k Iron Man run by Leotis Games, an absolute test of endurance, and was taken down by both Dom Ridley running Tau Empire, but the list we're going to be talking about today is Callum Byers playing Adeptus Mechanicus. Benefit of these style of events is that you do get the event over with in one day, although you probably have to catch up on sleep the second day anyway. Callum was running a Rad Zone core Adeptus Mechanicus build, something a little bit different than the standard Skitarii Hunter cohort that we typically see, and to be honest, the standard Skitarii Hunter cohort that I would have expected to see from Adeptus Mechanicus in this format. A lot of times I think you can kind of force your opponent to burn their own time and energy killing your Mechanicus units. I guess the downside being that a well-played Skitarii Hunter cohort can actually be very tiring and time-consuming to play. So instead today, Callum was running 2 Skitarii Marshals, a Tech Priest Manipulus with Peerless Eradicator to give his unit sustained hits, plus a Techno-Archaeologist to protect his backline objective. We were then running 2 units of Skitarii Rangers, 2 units of Skitarii Vanguard to hop those Skitarii Marshals into, plus 2 Scorpius Dune Riders to give them the benefits of their fire support as well. We had 1 big unit of Cataphren Breachers to jump that Manipulus into, an Onager Dune Crawler to add some backline shooting, that thing equipped with a neutron laser, plus a unit of Cerberus Raiders for scouts, some infiltrators from a unit of Sicarian infiltrators, and 3 Scorpius Disintegrators with Ferromite cannons for backline shooting to go alongside that neutron laser equipped Onager Dune Crawler. We then, last but certainly not least, had a little bit of melee counterpunch with a unit of Taser Lance Sidonian Dragoons. I will say these lists are probably not quite as effective as Qatari Hunter cohort, at least at playing the scoring game, but I imagine that they're a lot easier, which is probably why we're taking a Rad Zone Core army like this in order to play in this style of format where the physicality of the event is something that you have to keep in mind. We have a lot of infantry, potentially a lot of infantry and transports, which can actually kind of improve their playability, especially if they don't start on the table. Those guys are able to run out and complete objectives, and if you're not really worried about doing too much damage with them, you can actually save time by not declaring some of their attacks, or only attacking with their special weapons, for example. And then instead we're just focusing on essentially 5 units to do the majority of our damage. That includes the Cataphrone Breachers, the Onager Dune Crawler, as well as the 3 Scorpius Disintegrators. And if that's where all of your mental energy goes, and you can use the rest of your units to just complete secondaries and play out the game as it goes, keep enemies off of that brick of shooting, that's probably the best case scenario that you have. And to be fair, that brick of shooting is a lot. The Cataphrone Breachers especially are one of the big highlights of playing in Rad Zone Core. The amount of damage those guys can pump out with all of their buffs applied is crazy. Now, speaking of applying buffs, let's move over to the Broadsword Wargaming GT held in Ireland. This was a almost 60-player event and was taken down not only by Chaos Knights, but we've already talked about Chaos Knights. But so today we're going to be talking about Sam Nash and his Astra Militarum. Now, previously we did talk about some absolutely incredible scores, especially with Niklas's win over at the Raccoon Rumble. But look at these scores, everybody. Sam Nash with 300-point victories, a 99, and last, but I guess it is least, what a travesty of a win this was, a 92-point win. What was Sam winning with over here? The list is named, definitely not NASA's list, so I imagine that we're going to see some Fushini action in this composition. You can't fool me, Sam Nash. He was running Lord Solar Leontis and Militarum to best his command squad, as well as a standard platoon command squad to hang out with Lord Solar. We have a single tank commander with Grand Strategist to generate an additional vehicle order for him. 1 unit of Cadian Shock Troopers, a unit of alongside 2 units of Catachan Jungle Fighters. Now, we have no transports for these Catachan Jungle Fighters to use, which is pretty common more recently, to give them the ability to scout move those transports, and you can kind of just body block the center of the table with those fairly resilient Chimera chassis. Instead, one of these Catachan Jungle Fighter units has to be the host to the platoon command squad alongside Lord Solar Leontis. A little bit of an idiosyncrasy of the faction is that the Cadian Shock Trooper squad, while you would think that it would be one of the better backline units to jump Lord Solar into, not only does it not get access to mortars like the platoon command squad does, but it also just can't attach the platoon command squad at all. You have to take the specific Cadian command squad in order to do that. So the Catachan Jungle Fighters is the only legal option to turn on the Master Vox combo for Lord Solar here. Just a weird piece of note keeping for Astra Militarum players. But the Cadian Shock Trooper unit is still very useful, just as a unit that can run forward and lock in objectives and potentially force your opponent to move out aggressively and actually take territory from the Astra Militarum, which moves more of their units in line of sight. A lot of times with Militarum players, all they want to do is set up in a position where they are setting up for a straight up gunfight with their opponent. And if the Cadian Shock Troopers have the opportunity to take an objective and hold on to it for a round, your opponent is forced to engage with you in order to take that objective back. And if they don't, then eventually they'll lose on primary. So the Shock Troopers are a very nice inclusion for that reason. Now we have a unit of 6 Bullgrin in the army alongside a single Hellhound to remove cover from enemies. And also, to be honest, act as another little bit of a mid-board control. The Hellhounds come in with a base 2+ armor save, so they're very difficult to kill, and they can provide some pretty solid overwatch because this one is running its big 2d6 shot Inferno Cannon plus a heavy flamer, so it can knock out utility units that are running up the table. Not very expensive, highly resilient, and provides an army support ability. Just an incredible datasheet. We have 2 Leman Russ battle tanks. Those guys packing multi-meltas and las cannons alongside their battle cannon to get rerolls targeting enemies on objectives, plus a Leman Russ exterminator as well to apply that AP buff. The downside of the battle cannons is that their base AP values are very low. So once you add the exterminator's AP bonus plus ignore cover from the Hellhounds, these things can actually kill a lot of stuff, and even shooting at heavy targets. Even though their strength isn't the greatest thing ever, they will be getting lethal hits, which alongside alongside those rerolls can cause them to do some pretty serious damage. We then have 2 Ogryn squads, 60 points apiece with a billion attacks. These guys are good at clearing infantry, as we've discussed on the channel before. And then last but certainly not least, ooh, look at all those Tempestus Aquilons. 3 units of 10 Tempestus Aquilons. We'll see if these guys continue to see play in as voluminous numbers as they are right now. If the World Championships of Warhammer FAQs go through, they have kind of retroactively eroded the Aquilon datasheet to prevent them from 3-inch deep striking in your opponent's turn. They have to do so on their own turn. Still useful, but makes them much worse at rapid ingressing in ridiculously bizarre places. So we'll see if that ends up sticking and becoming an official Games Workshop FAQ. I imagine that it will, and if that's the case, then we probably won't see these triple Tempestus Aquilons, but I imagine they will still see some play, just for their capacity to drop in basically anywhere you need them to, shoot 2 flamer shots when they pop in, and then complete secondaries. That's still very good value for 90 points. We also then have a unit of standard Tempestus Ions that's to attach the Tempestus Command Squad into, which obviously can't attach into the Aquilon squads. Those guys bring a bunch of special weapons, alongside the orders and sustained hits from their officer, plus their own hit rerolls. They're just good at clearing out infantry in a lot of different situations. Now lastly, let's jump back to the next island over to England and talk about the North Staffs GT. This was a much smaller event, only about 20 players in this one, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk about it because it was taken down with a 5-0 record by Tyranids. Nice to see Tyranids putting up a couple of results. They did have a draw result over at the Raccoon Rumble, but this is the one with all undefeateds that we're going to be talking about today. David was running a Vanguard Onslaught. This is the very aggressive forward operator focused detachment from the Tyranid Codex. This included a Broodlord with Stalker, so he's able to choose a unit at the start of the game and get a hit and wound bonus against it, plus a second Broodlord and a Neurotyrant. No other enhancements on those guys. We have 2 units of Hormigons, which can act as kind of, I guess, honorary Vanguard invaders, since they have the ability built in to advance and charge. We have a single Biovore, as well as 2 units of 10 Genestealers to attach those Broodlords into. These guys do get advanced charge from their Broodlords. The units are relatively expensive, but they give you, especially if you go first, the capacity to really put on the pressure on your opponent from the get-go. If you deploy them on the line, depending on who goes first, they can potentially jump into a protected position so they're not out in the open. However, if you go first, they can just rush 8 inches directly forward, advance another 8 plus their advance roll forward, and then potentially charge if your opponent is on their own deployment line. And putting 22 Wound Genestealers in your opponent's deployment zone, potentially on the first turn of the game, is a huge tempo buff. We then have 3 Lictors to act as infiltrators to prevent enemies from blocking off those Genestealer scout moves by taking up the realist space in front of them. We have a Neurolictor to buff the rest of the team and also act as another infiltrator alongside those Lictors. Interestingly, a unit of Von Ryan's Leapers, that is another infiltrator that often gets used just to eat real estate. The other benefit that Von Ryan's Leapers have is if you're in kind of a melee mirror match, the Von Ryan's Leapers can act to mitigate kind of offensive enemy units, and especially high volume enemies that are able to clear out things like those Genestealers very quickly. Von Ryan's Leapers can embed themselves either in the Genestealer unit or in front of it, and if your opponent pushes super far forward, the Von Ryan's Leapers can heroically intervene, fight first, and hopefully kill them or kill enough of them that they're not really going to be able to do lasting damage back to your army. So for 70 points, they have a newly reduced points value. They are definitely not a bad unit, certainly a good inclusion. And some matchups, like Orks, for example, that are all about melee aggression, super don't want to see these guys. Just have very little way to deal with them because their shooting is not really good enough to get through a multi-wound stealth unit. We then have a bunch of monsters to take the center of the table, including 3 Maleceptors, 1 Rupture Cannon Tyrannifex to add some armor cracking, and that's compounding with a unit of Zoanthropes that can attach that Neurotyrant into to hit on 2s and just be a pretty solid, big ranged attacker. Overall, pretty balanced approach to Vanguard Onslaught. A lot of the Vanguard invasions that we've seen in the past have been focused super heavily on those melee units and trying to get just insane amounts of melee aggression out. I think the lists like these that kind of temper that with some shooting and are able to take table space in the early game and then solidify that lead with their Maleceptors are probably a little bit more well-rounded. So if you're playing in a singles format rather than a team format, where you're not necessarily, where you really have no guarantee over what your matchup is, lists like these do make a lot more sense. And it's cool to see them see some success as well. So with that, those are all the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one is your favorite. Thanks to 40k Combat Cards for sponsoring this video. And thanks to you for watching all the way to the end. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.